Ryan Benjamin penciled a page, and now Mark Morales will show you how he inks those pencils.
Check out the penciling process at proko.com/marvel.
What's great about the inking process is that you can focus on the line work even more than when you're in the penciling stage. You'll have solved all of the other problems that you may have been working out before, and now you can make sure your lines have energy, variety, and just look cool.
I work with a lot of people from around the world, and shipping is very questionable at times. And to save time, they'll send me a scan of their pencils, and I'll convert it in Photoshop to this blue right here, which is non-repro, so that when you ink it and you scan it again to send it off to the colorist, the blue will just drop out and just have the black line. The most important thing when you're inking somebody's pencils are to get the faces and the hands correct, because that's probably where the pencil put the most work into getting those two things right. Once you get those like locked in, the rest of it kind of flows easily. And you can even mess up on some of the other parts, but you won't really notice it because you're focusing on the face and the hands. For this one, I'm going to use like two different pen nibs. One that's been broken in like this one. You can tell the rusted ink on it. And a newer one is going to come out of the package. The older one you can do more brushy type lines with. And for this one, I'm using a little bit of ammonia in it so it flows a little bit smoother. You can test it out by finding a black area and just making some lines to see if it works. And Ryan is one of the guys who has a very distinct 90s feel to his work, like Jim Lee and Will Spartasio and Todd McFarlane and all those guys. It ends up where there's a lot of little angles in it, not a smooth figure. It's like it's almost like a sculpture where there's like a lot of little crevices to it. You want to kind of go in there and work with the pencils that he gave you and play with those little angles. I mean, if it was another pencil, I would just completely give one line weight all the way around the figure, but demands a little bit more of a angled approach to it. Go with the light source, where you try and figure out where the light source is going, and then if it's closer to the light source, you make the line thinner. If it's further away, you make it a little bit thicker. So in this case, the light source is sort of coming from above and in front of him because of the way he drew the shadow. So basically, the top of his head would have a thinner line, maybe even a broken line. And then the underneath parts, the parts that are away from the light would have a little bit heavier line, like this. A good way to remember it is by maybe just in pencil, just putting an arrow on the part of the page where you think the light is coming from, so you can sort of keep referring back to that to know where the light is hitting from. I could easily cut into the paper by pressing too hard, or I could easily break the pen nib and go super duper thin, and you get that super fat line with it too. You can see the difference. So it's just a matter of the pressure you put on it and trial and error, really. Underneath here is under the shadowed area, so I can go much heavier, because it's going to be into black. The lines don't have to be precise because you can always go back in later, like I am, with a brush or a brush marker and smooth them up a little bit. You're just basically laying in the main structure right now. One of the reasons I always spin around the page like this too is that if I'm working over here for a while and I'll move over somewhere else so you don't smear the ink, I'm going to go in with a newer pen nib to do a lot of the cross-hatching and such. But again, the way I'm doing it is the way I do it. Some people will sit there and noodle all the way through the face first and then move down. Other people will just spot the blacks in with a brush and then come back in with a nib. Feathering is what we're going to do next. Say this is an arm here. You can do it with a brush where you feather it, or it's you're trying to go around the form and you're going from thin to thick to show form going into black. That's with a brush, or a brush pen in this case. With a nib, it's the same process, it's just a little more precise. You're going in like that. Basically start at the top of the line thin, and you go thick as it goes down. I find that that's the better way to do it. Some people will try and do it where you're going from the thick to the other end, but I find that you don't control where the line ends. If you're doing it the other way, you're controlling the beginning of the line and end of the line, the thickness, so you have more control over where it begins and ends, and it doesn't look as haphazard as it can look if you go the other way. With this, you go really light, and then as you get towards the black, you put a little more pressure on it, and it gets thicker towards the bottom. And you try to keep that in mind throughout the whole thing, because again, the light is hitting from above here, so this would be the lightest part of that rib muscle, and it goes into the black. The black is going into the shadow, So you're trying to just give it a little bit of pressure at the beginning and work into the black. And even just sitting there for a few minutes, the ink can dry on, so you have to go back in sometimes and just scrape it clean. I was doing most of the feathering lines with the thinner pen nib, but for some thicker ones where you want to go back in, you'll go back in with the heavier one to give you a heavier line to begin with, a chunkier line. There's a huge upswing in the detail in comic art in the 90s when people realized that they could finally, every line they could draw would show up. I mean, you'd have a few artists that were very detailed before that, like Barry Windsor Smith is one of the great ones. But if you look at his line work back in the 70s on comic book stuff, he still uses a thicker brush line, so it still would show up. But guys like Arthur Adams and Steve McNiven and all, Jimmy Chung, they use a really thin line now that can show up that wouldn't have shown up back then. I think in a weird way, it actually hurt the pencilers in a weird way, because the pencils that used to come in from the beginning of comics to the late 80s, early 90s tended to be a little bit looser. A whole generation of kids grew up on Jim Lee stuff and Todd McFarlane and Mark Silvestri, super detailed guys. And in a weird way, I think a lot of the kids that were looking at those pages, which were great, they thought that Jim was sitting there and drawing every single line that was printed, not realizing that Scott Williams or R.T. Bear or a bunch of their inkers were going in and adding a lot of the rendering and this, that, and the other. So the kids that grew up in that era loving that style of artwork, they started drawing that way. It ended up being like a double-edged sword. I mean, it made them go slower, because to add all that stuff, you're basically trying to ink it in pencil, which takes a lot longer. And it sort of took away a lot of the spontaneousness of the inkers, because they were more required to follow the super meticulous pencils that the guys put down, which is understandable. You put 40 hours into a page, you'd like the inker to put 40 hours into a page or whatever, but it took away the spontaneity, because some of the best examples in comic art, in my opinion, were where you had two capable artists, the capable pencil and the capable inker, and they came together and ended up coming up with something that is sort of like a third artist, you know, like a hybrid mix between both of them that would never be achieved with anyone else, because everyone inks differently. So you can go to a guy like John Byrne, who was inked by a million different people. Two examples are, he did a celebrated run on the X-Men with Terry Austin, and Terry Austin was a great inker, very meticulous and stylistic. He also did a run with Joe Rubinstein on Captain America, and Joe is more of a brush style inker. And both books are by John Byrne, but both books look different and they both look equally great. But it's like you're coming up with a hybrid Byrne Austin and a Byrne Rubinstein thing. And, you know, within that, you know, you might have your favorites or not. It worked out for the pencilers in the fact that they could do more than one book a month, and the inkers were able to play around and put a little bit more of their distinctive touch on the pencils. At almost every stage of making comics and art, you got to be good at penciling. So make sure you're watching those lessons and doing the assignments so you can get good at inking, layout, thumbnailing, and all that other stuff you need to make good art. I could have inked everything with this thin line right here, and it would look okay, but it might flatten out and look a little bit like a coloring book. Whereas, you know, if you're playing around with different line weights like that, and like that, and like this, and some other ones, you know, like these little ones. The main thing about inking is you're trying to create an illusion of depth in three-dimensionality to something. And when you ink everything with the same with the same line, not even, you know, just the same dead line, it doesn't really do that. You want to create an illusion of depth. So basically the simplest thing to do that is break up an image into three things: the foreground, the midground, and the background. It inevitably looks like this thing is in the foreground. Just start on the midground thing, ink everything, and then everything behind it, you use a thinner line. Everything in front of it, use a thicker line. And then you just create like that obvious illusion of depth. You can also do that by overlapping figures too, where if I put this in front of this, it inevitably looks like you're creating the depth. But also, if you make the line weights different, you can really make a person feel like they could walk into the panel. This is the idea. Now is when I'd probably go in and clean up a little bit of it, going with like a brush pen or a regular brush or whatever, and just sort of smooth out some of the lines. Bold it out a little bit, maybe smooth it out. I mean, you can even use the brush to do some feathering too, if you'd like, in spots. And also to just sort of Swap in the areas that are going to be black. And even with the brush though, you still try and keep a little bit of the general energy of the pencils. Like I said, Ryan's stuff has a lot of little angles and twists and turns in it to sort of make it pop. Well, in my case, I try to work it out with the pen and brush lines before that, so that when I'm at the end, when I'm spotting the blacks, it's just, blacks. But if you're inking the whole thing with the brush, you really can go in there and sort of figure out a little bit more of, nooks and crannies of the figure. Okay, so now on the face, he has like feathering going into black areas. So I want to be precise with this, because again, the faces and the hands are the thing. Maybe tighten up my line work a little bit here. The feathering is really a hand thing. When you're doing the shapes, it's more of a whole arm thing, like right now. And it's also why I move the paper around so you can sort of get the angle that you want. Like it says feathering here, but it's like super fine feathering. Kind of want to use the newer nib as a sharper point to it. Like I say, you work on an area a little bit, let it dry, and then you can go back in and add the crosshatching lines. But you gotta let it dry though, because again, if you're just trying to go to two different directions with the lines, it'll just sort of bleed into each other. In this case, I'm really thinking of the light source again. It's hitting the forehead, kind of at the top, right at the bottom of his head. It's hitting his nose. It's hitting a bit of his mouth and his cheek. So you're sort of just trying to follow what he drew and keeping the light source in mind so it looks consistent all the way through. The light source and all that doesn't have to be super realistic or whatever. It just has to be consistent within the drawing. You can draw a guy with gigantic biceps, and as long as you keep it consistent throughout the whole thing, it looks like it's on its own model. It's like if the problem is when everything starts to vary from panel to panel, to page to page. And it's the same thing with the lighting and all that too. It doesn't have to be super realistic. It just has to make sense within what you're doing on the panel. Try over here so you can go back in, get a little bit of a double line so it doesn't look quite as smooth. Make sure the cheekbone has a little bit of an accent. You go back into the black a little bit there. The little halo, the little white area here, sometimes you use it to separate the blacks. Because if I didn't do that, the pec would just blend into the shoulder. So just a little bit of a halo, not too much, but just enough that you pick it up as there's a little separation of the forms. Let's finish up this hand. The Black Panther, he has those talon things there, so you might want to just hit it with a little accent of black. All right, so with this right here, like I just did over here, since it's going around his fingers, the light, you start off thin. Again, the light source. The light source is like coming from like this angle here on his head. So this side of the finger would be lighter than this side. You sort of use the line work and just applying pressure to make lines heavier as it goes around the form. It's like the old Choose Your Own Adventure books. You could do every line differently. So you just have to pick the line that you think is going to work best on this. I mean, it's also, like I said, sort of the, when you're doing something with the blue line, it's sort of the freedom of it, because if I screwed this up completely, I could just go back in and print out another one and do it over again. Whereas if it's on the original, the one shot and you're done, so you have to get it right. Lately, I've been in this thing where I just sort of go in with the brush pen and just sort of outline where I'm going to fill in the black, so I can just slap the ink in there a lot quicker. This is a time-saving thing, but you can sit there and just go in with the brush and slowly fill in all the areas. This is a fiber tip thing, just to kind of just block in the blacks so that it's easier with the brush. And it's pointy enough that if there's any last second things you want to touch up, you can do it with that. If I want to thicken up this line, I can go in there and thicken it up a little bit. I don't even know if I hit all the areas, but just enough of them so that when I go in with the brush, I don't have to be as precise. I use it for rendering, sometimes for hair, especially if it's like a brunette type of hair. It really just sort of whatever approach you come across. Like on this page, like I said, Brian has more of that 90s Jim Lee-esque style. That's like the base of his stuff. So you kind of want to approach it with that type of pen energy. When I started, everything I did was with a brush. And I was able to, get that type of line work out of the brush. I mean, a brush is a different animal than a pen, because with a pen, it's like a pencil. You're using like a pencil, whereas a brush, you're drawing with hair. So it's a different animal altogether. But you can get equally expressive lines with both. It just may be a little bit harder to master with the brush. And for a lot of the super fine, detailed artwork that a lot of pencilers are doing these days, it's probably a harder proposition because, like I said, they're adding minute details like this. So you could do it with a brush, but you might lose a little bit of the crispness that they're going for. Your job as an inker is, if the penciler made a mistake on the anatomy, you have to go in there and complete it. You have to go in there and finish it and make it look consistent. So like some of the muscles in the hand here are a little bit weird. I have to go in there and fix it up a little bit. And then when I spot the black, I'll go in there and see if it needs a little bit more to sort of make it some more solid. So this is why having a working knowledge of how to draw is very important, because there are going to be times when you're going to have to go in there and you're going to have to redraw a hand or fix a face or something that might not have been drawn right, or just by accident they didn't draw it right. Like I've had guys that have gone in there and they're rushing through it and they may have drawn 4 fingers on a hand, or this person's missing an ear or whatever. You have to be able to go in there and confidently draw it and keep it within the style of what they're doing, so it doesn't look like somebody put a ear transplant or something on. Okay, so now just filling in the blacks on this. Like I said, you want a good brush. This is like a Raphael 8404 number 3. It's thin enough where you can get super fine lines if you need to, but it's fat enough where you can fill in blacks like this easily. Just trying to keep at least some of the energy that Ryan put into it and his individuality, and also putting a little bit of your stamp on it too. When I started, the whole point was to make the page as bulletproof as possible, that even if you had a bad color job, the black and white would show through hopefully enough that you did your job. But the colorists these days have just gotten to be remarkable. They're so good these days that you don't have to really worry about that. So you just try and give them something visually pleasing and done well enough where they can sort of have room to go crazy on. All right, so for whiting out and touching up stuff, I use one of 3 things. Either simple whiteout pen, one of these paint marker things, or bleed-proof white it's called. It's like an opaque watercolor that you can go over the ink and you can even draw back on top of it somewhat. It's basically, I would use this just to highlight some areas and make them pop out a little bit. So I put some water in this one. This is a synthetic brush, like a number 1, a really fine one. You just go back in there and you're just like adding a couple of accents here, just to make it pop a little bit more. Like by putting the extra white line here, it makes the arm like pop a little bit more in front. Same thing over here. Nothing too crazy, but just like little accents to make it pop a little bit. Like it's like a weathered boot he has there, so you like just go into the black a little bit. And then you can also use the touch up, and this circle is not 100% perfect, so go in there with a little bit of white to touch it up. And you can also use the white out to do like different effects like stars or like, dirt spraying up or whatever. But I'll show some of that on the next piece. Since the Black Panther's gloves have like those little ridges to them, just go and follow it up the arm so that it sort of goes into the black a little bit. There'll be another one here, just to get that whole thing up there, and then got it followed on the other side too. For the most part, this one is basically over. Black Panther.